The Texas sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a golden glow across the vast, open land. The heat of the day had begun to ease, making way for a quiet, peaceful evening. Frank Callahan sat on his porch, a weathered hand wrapped around a coffee mug, though the liquid inside had long gone cold. He wasn't much for company these days, hadn't been since Mary passed 3 years ago. At 68, Frank had learned to make peace with solitude. His ranch, a stretch of land that had been in his family for generations, kept him busy enough. There were fences to mend, cattle to check on, and an old truck that needed fixing more often than it ran. But nights like these, the still, lonesome ones, had a way of making the house feel too big, too empty. He wasn't looking for a dog. He hadn't planned on driving into Austin that day, hadn't thought about stopping by the shelter. But something about the way the morning felt, just a little too quiet, a little too heavy, pushed him to do something different. And that was how he found himself standing in front of a row of kennels, staring into a pair of deep brown eyes that held the weight of 1,000 unspoken stories. She was a golden retriever, her coat thick and golden but graying slightly around the muzzle. Not young, not a puppy full of boundless energy, but an old soul, much like him. Her name was Daisy, according to the tag on her kennel, though it looked like she'd seen better days. "She's been here a while," the shelter worker had said, a young woman with kind eyes. "Older dogs don't get picked as often." Frank had only nodded. He understood that feeling all too well. He didn't ask about her past. Didn't need to. The way she held herself, gentle, patient, as if waiting for something or someone who would never come, told him everything he needed to know. And so, without much thought, he filled out the paperwork, paid the small adoption fee, and loaded Daisy into his truck. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Daisy sat in the passenger seat, her head resting on the edge of the window, eyes half-lidded as the warm wind ruffled her fur. Every now and then, Frank would glance over at her, feeling the unfamiliar weight of companionship settle into his bones. It had been a long time since he'd shared his space with another living soul. Back at the ranch, Daisy took to her new home with quiet acceptance. She padded across the wooden floors of the house as if she had always belonged there. She never strayed too far, always within a few feet of Frank as he went about his day. At night, she curled up on an old rug beside the fireplace, her rhythmic breathing filling the silence that had once felt unbearable. It wasn't until a week later, while brushing her thick coat, that Frank noticed something strange. Her leather collar, worn, sturdy, well-made, had a small bulge near the buckle. It wasn't obvious at first, but when he ran his fingers over it, he could feel the distinct edges of something hidden beneath the layers of leather. He frowned, carefully unfastening the collar and examining it closer. The stitching near the edge had come loose just enough to reveal a glimpse of aged, yellowed paper tucked inside. A letter. Frank hesitated. His fingers hovered over the delicate, time-worn material, his breath catching slightly in his chest. He wasn't sure why his heart had picked up its pace, why his hands suddenly felt unsteady. It was just an old letter, nothing more. And yet, something told him that whatever was inside wasn't just a forgotten scrap of paper. Slowly, carefully, he unfolded it. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. The handwriting, neat and deliberate, belonged to someone who had taken great care in choosing their words. Frank's eyes flickered to the top of the page, where a single name was written in elegant cursive. Margaret Holloway. The date below it read November 1945. For a long moment, Frank simply stared. Outside, the crickets had begun their nightly chorus, and the soft rustling of the trees carried through the open windows. Inside, Daisy watched him, her head tilted ever so slightly, as if she, too, sensed that something significant had just been uncovered. Frank swallowed. He had a feeling that this was no ordinary letter. And, somehow, he knew that this journey, the one he hadn't been looking for was only just beginning. Frank Callahan sat at his kitchen table, the yellowed paper spread out before him. The light from the overhead lamp cast soft shadows across its worn edges, highlighting the creases where it had been folded for decades. His fingers traced the delicate script, though he hadn't yet mustered the courage to read beyond the name and date. Margaret Holloway. November 1945. Frank leaned back in his chair, running a weathered hand over his face. The year alone was enough to stir something deep in his chest. 1945, the end of the war. His father had fought in that war. So had uncles, cousins, neighbors, boys who had left Texas soil with strong hands and hopeful hearts, only for some to return changed, and others not at all. He exhaled slowly. Across the room, Daisy sat on her haunches, watching him with quiet patience. She had been the one carrying this letter, unknowingly safeguarding it for years. How long had it been hidden in that collar? Who had put it there? Frank turned the collar over in his hands, studying the cracked leather. It was a fine make, the kind that had been built to last. Had it belonged to another dog before her? Daisy wagged her tail slightly, as if sensing his thoughts. "Well, girl," Frank murmured, scratching behind her ears. "Guess we ought to find out what we're dealing with." With that, he leaned forward and began to read. November 1945. My dearest Margaret. If you are reading this, it means I never made it home. Frank's breath caught. His grip on the letter tightened. I don't know if this will reach you. War is an unpredictable thing. But I have to try, because I can't let you live your life wondering if I ever thought of you. I did. Every day. Through every march, every sleepless night, every prayer whispered into the cold, you were there. Do you remember the old oak tree by the river? You always said we'd carve our names into it when I came back. I hope you did, even if it was just yours alone. I promised I would come home to you. But if I couldn't, I wanted to leave you with this, my last words, my last love. I sent Rusty with this letter. If he made it to you, then he kept his promise too. Be happy, Margaret. Live the life we dreamed of. Forever yours. James Holloway. Frank set the letter down, staring at it as the weight of the words settled over him. James Holloway. A soldier. A man in love. A promise that had never been fulfilled. And Rusty, whoever he was, had been meant to deliver this letter. But he hadn't. Frank ran a hand through his graying hair. He'd never been one for sentimentality, but something about this felt personal. This wasn't just some old love letter lost to time. This was a message meant for someone, a final goodbye that had never reached the woman it was written for. And somehow, through time and chance, it had ended up in his hands. Daisy let out a soft whine, nudging his knee with her snout. Frank sighed. Well, hell, he muttered. Guess we can't just let it lie, can we? He stood, letter still in hand, and moved toward the small bookshelf in his living room. Pulling out an old leather-bound address book, he flipped through the pages, searching. Holloway. That name wasn't unfamiliar. There had been a Holloway family in town when he was a boy. The old farm off Route 36, wasn't that a Holloway place once? He needed answers. And if there was any chance that Margaret, or someone connected to her, was still out there, Frank knew what he had to do. It was time to dig into the past. To uncover the story that had remained hidden for nearly 80 years. Frank sat at his old wooden desk, the letter still trembling slightly between his fingers. He wasn't a man prone to emotion, life had hardened him in more ways than one, but something about those words, written by a man long gone, had stirred something deep in his chest. He read it again, slower this time, letting every sentence sink in. If you are reading this, it means I never made it home. The weight of those words sat heavy on Frank's heart. He pictured James Holloway, a young soldier, maybe no older than 22 or 23, sitting in some foreign trench, pen in hand, trying to say goodbye to the woman he loved. How many others had done the same? How many letters like this had been lost to time? And yet, by some twist of fate, this one had found its way to him. Frank exhaled, setting the fragile paper down carefully on the desk. He looked over at Daisy, who lay on the floor by his feet, head resting on her paws, her big brown eyes watching him. "You carried this, girl," he muttered. "Or at least, someone before you did." The mention of Rusty in the letter made Frank wonder. The way James wrote about him, so certain that the dog would complete his mission, it meant something. James had trusted that dog to bring Margaret his final words. But he never did. Frank's gaze fell back to the leather collar on the desk. Had Rusty been found by someone else? Had he wandered for years, carrying this letter until time forgot about it? The thought sent a shiver down Frank's spine. Margaret Holloway. If she had been waiting for James, she never got this letter. She never knew he had died thinking of her, loving her. Frank clenched his jaw. It wasn't right. He pushed back his chair and stood up, grabbing his worn leather jacket from the coat rack. It was an old habit. Whenever something unsettled him, he worked. Kept his hands busy. Out on the porch, the cool Texas evening air greeted him. The sky stretched wide, burning orange and purple as the sun dipped below the horizon. The scent of dry earth and hay filled his lungs, grounding him. He'd spent his whole life working this land. It had a way of making a man feel small, reminding him that time kept moving forward, whether he was ready for it or not. Daisy padded up beside him, her tail wagging gently. Frank looked down at her. "What do you think, girl? Should we find out who Margaret was?" She tilted her head, as if considering it. Frank huffed a quiet chuckle, running a hand down her back. "Guess that's a yes." He turned back inside and reached for the phone. Emily Carter was the only person he knew who could help. The next morning, Frank found himself sitting across from Emily at the local diner, a fresh cup of coffee steaming between them. Emily was in her mid-30s, a sharp-eyed journalist who had spent years digging into old town records and historical archives. If anyone could uncover the story behind this letter, it was her. Frank slid the fragile paper across the table. "Tell me what you think." Emily adjusted her glasses, handling the letter with the same care one might use with an ancient relic. As she read, her expression softened, the lines in her forehead deepening with understanding. After a long pause, she looked up. This is incredible," she whispered. "You realize what you have here, right?" Frank nodded slowly. "I do. But the question is, what do we do with it?" Emily set the letter down, her fingers tracing the name at the top. "There was a Margaret Holloway here in town," she said. "I remember seeing her name in some of the old archives. She passed away years ago, but I think she had family. Maybe a granddaughter?" Frank leaned back, rubbing his chin. "I need to know if she ever got another letter," he muttered. "If she ever knew what happened to James." Emily's gaze was steady. "Then let's find out." By the afternoon, Emily had dug up an old census record. Margaret Holloway had lived in this town until the early 2000s. Never married. No record of children. But she had a niece, Claire Holloway, who now lived in San Antonio. Frank stared at the name on the paper. He knew what he had to do. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The next morning, Frank Callahan stood on his porch, watching the sky lighten over the Texas horizon. A warm breeze rustled the tall grass, carrying the scent of sun-baked earth and morning dew. It was the kind of peacefulness he usually enjoyed. But today, his mind was elsewhere. On the table beside him sat the letter, carefully folded back into its envelope, along with the name Emily had given him, Claire Holloway, San Antonio. He hadn't been to San Antonio in years. The city had never suited him much, too crowded, too fast. But this wasn't about comfort. This was about doing what was right. Frank glanced down at Daisy, who sat by his boots, her tail wagging gently. "Well, girl," he sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Guess we're going on a little trip." The road stretched long and open ahead of him, miles of sun-baked highway cutting through the rolling Texas countryside. Frank drove in silence, his old truck rattling softly with every bump in the road. Daisy sat in the passenger seat, her head resting on the window's edge, ears flicking with every passing gust of wind. San Antonio loomed on the horizon, a sprawling cityscape that felt worlds apart from the quiet ranch life Frank had known. He wasn't sure what he was expecting. When he pulled up to the small, neatly kept house listed in Emily's notes, Frank sat in the truck for a long moment, staring at the front door. This wasn't his business. Margaret Holloway had lived her life, whether she got this letter or not. Maybe he was stirring up something best left alone. Then he looked at Daisy. She had carried this letter, or rather, her ancestors had. Through war, through generations, through loss and time. Frank sighed. "No turning back now, girl." He stepped out of the truck, smoothing the creases in his shirt before making his way to the front porch. With a deep breath, he knocked. A few moments later, the door opened to reveal a woman in her late 40s, dark hair pulled into a loose bun, glasses perched on her nose. She studied him with mild curiosity. "Can I help you?" Frank cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how ridiculous this might sound. "Ma'am, my name's Frank Callahan. I don't mean to bother you, but I think I might have something that belonged to your family." Her brow furrowed. "I'm sorry, who did you say you were?" He hesitated, then pulled the letter from his pocket, holding it out gently. This was written by a man named James Holloway. "For your aunt, Margaret." It never made it to her. For a moment, Claire didn't move. Her eyes flickered to the paper in his hand, then back to his face, guarded, uncertain. Frank braced himself for her to tell him to leave. For her to shake her head and say she wasn't interested. But instead, she stepped aside. "Come in." Frank sat on Claire's couch, Daisy resting at his feet as Claire turned the letter over in her hands, studying it like a piece of history. "I never knew my aunt well," Claire admitted finally, her voice soft. "I was a kid when she passed, but I remember her house. She had all these old photographs, things from the war. She never married, never had children. I guess we always thought she just never found the right person." Frank nodded, watching as she carefully unfolded the letter. When she began to read, her expression shifted, curiosity melting into something deeper, something heavier. "He loved her," she whispered, barely loud enough to hear. Frank nodded. "Seems that way." Claire exhaled, blinking quickly. "She never talked about him. At least, not that I remember. But if she never got this letter, she must have thought he just never came back." The weight of it settled between them. A lifetime spent waiting. A love story that had ended before it had the chance to begin. Frank shifted in his seat. "I don't know how the letter got lost. He mentioned sending it with his dog, Rusty. Maybe something happened. Maybe the dog got separated before he could find her." Claire shook her head in disbelief. "And after all these years, it just finds its way back?" She let out a soft, almost disbelieving laugh. "That's something, isn't it?" Frank gave a small smile. "It is." For a long moment, Claire was quiet, staring at the letter, lost in thought. Finally, she looked up. I think my aunt would have wanted to know. Even if she never got to see it herself. Frank nodded. That's why I brought it to you. Claire set the letter down, glancing at Daisy. And this girl, she's the one who had it. Frank chuckled. Not exactly. But I reckon she's the last in a long line of dogs that did. Claire smiled, reaching down to scratch Daisy's ears. Well, I'd say she finished what they started. Frank felt something settle inside him, a quiet kind of peace. The letter had found its way home, even if it was decades too late. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As Frank stood to leave, Claire hesitated. I think people should hear this story, she said. Not just me. My aunt's gone, but maybe her story, their story, shouldn't be forgotten. Frank thought about that for a moment, then nodded. I know someone who can help with that. Emily. She'd know what to do. As he stepped back out onto the porch, the sun hanging low in the afternoon sky, Frank took one last glance at the house. Maybe this wasn't the ending Margaret Holloway had hoped for. But it was an ending. And sometimes, that was enough. Frank Callahan had driven back to his ranch by nightfall, but sleep never came easy when his mind was restless. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Margaret Holloway. She had lived an entire life believing James never came home for her. She had never remarried, never found someone else. And all the while, his final words, the promise he tried to keep, had been locked away in a forgotten collar, lost to time. Frank rolled onto his side, exhaling deeply. What a thing to carry. By morning, he knew there was one last thing left to do. 2 days later, Frank and Daisy sat across from Emily Carter at the local newspaper office. The room smelled of ink and old paper, dust catching in the beams of sunlight filtering through the window. Emily pushed her glasses up on her nose as she flipped through the photographs Claire had sent over. Black and white images of a young Margaret, bright-eyed and hopeful, with neatly curled hair and a modest dress. And then, one that made Frank's throat tighten, Margaret and James, standing by a tree, his arms slung around her shoulders, the happiness in their faces so obvious it nearly hurt to look at. They were just kids, Emily murmured, shaking her head. So young. Frank nodded, rubbing his fingers together absently. It's a damn shame she never knew. That letter might have changed things for her. Emily set the photo down and met his gaze. But she left something behind. This story. It matters. Frank let out a slow breath, glancing down at Daisy. The dog had stretched out at his feet, content as always, as if unaware that she had carried a piece of history with her. So, what happens now? He asked. Emily leaned back in her chair, thoughtful. I think we write about it. Tell their story. A soldier's last words, lost for nearly 80 years, found in the collar of a dog that somehow carried it through time. People need to hear it, Frank. Frank hesitated, his fingers grazing the old leather collar in his pocket. He wasn't a man who liked attention, didn't care for the way stories got picked apart and turned into spectacle. But this wasn't about him. It was about Margaret. About James. He nodded. All right. Let's do it. The article ran in the Sunday paper under the title A Soldier's Final Goodbye, the letter that took 80 years to be delivered. The story spread quickly, making its way into local news, then national outlets. People were drawn to it, drawn to the idea that love, no matter how long it took, had found its way back. Frank received letters from strangers, people who had lost loved ones to war, who understood the weight of unfinished goodbyes. Some simply wrote to say that they had cried while reading, that they had once waited for a letter that never came. But the one that meant the most came from Claire Holloway. She wrote to say thank you. That she had taken the letter to the oak tree by the river, the one James had mentioned. And there, just as he had wished all those years ago, she carved their names into the bark. Margaret and James. Forever. Frank read that line over and over, something tight catching in his chest. Maybe that was the real ending. Not regret. Not loss. Just remembrance. A week after the article was published, Frank sat on his porch, Daisy stretched out beside him. The air was warm, cicadas humming in the distance. He watched the land roll out before him, golden fields stretching far beyond what the eye could see. For so long, he had thought of his life as something behind him, memories of a younger man, moments that had already come and gone. But this had reminded him that life had a way of surprising you, even when you thought there was nothing left to find. He reached down, scratching Daisy behind the ears. "You did good, girl," he murmured. And maybe, just maybe, so had he. The morning air was crisp as Frank Callahan stepped onto his porch, a mug of coffee warming his hands. Daisy lay stretched out beside him, her golden fur catching the soft light of dawn. It had been nearly 2 weeks since the article about James and Margaret had run in the paper, and the response had been overwhelming. Letters had come from all over the country, veterans who had lost friends in the war, widows who had never received their own goodbyes, even people who simply wanted to share how the story had moved them. But there was one letter, handwritten on old stationery, that had caught Frank's attention most of all. It had come from a man named Thomas Holloway, James's nephew. The letter had been brief but carried a weight that made Frank's chest tighten as he read it. "Mr. Callahan, I read your article about my Uncle James. My father, his younger brother, spoke of him often but never knew what truly happened to him. Your discovery of the letter answered questions my family had been asking for decades. But there is more to this story, something I believe you should see for yourself. If you're willing, I'd like to meet you in Fort Worth. I believe I may have the last missing piece." Frank had stared at that letter for a long time. There was something about it, something unfinished, that tugged at him in a way he couldn't ignore. And so, just after sunrise, Frank loaded Daisy into his truck and set off toward Fort Worth. Thomas Holloway lived in an old Victorian house just outside of the city, tucked away behind towering oak trees. Frank pulled into the gravel driveway, stepping out as an older man, maybe in his late 60s, walked onto the porch. He had deep-set eyes, the same kind of weathered look that only came from years of hard living, and when he smiled, it was hesitant, uncertain, but genuine. "You must be Frank Callahan," Thomas said, extending a hand. Frank shook it firmly. "And you must be James's nephew." Thomas nodded, glancing at the truck where Daisy sat in the passenger seat, watching them carefully. "That your girl?" Frank chuckled. "She's the one who carried the letter, one way or another." Thomas smiled faintly, then motioned for Frank to follow him inside. The house was filled with history, old photographs in tarnished silver frames, bookshelves lined with dusty hard covers, the scent of aged wood lingering in the air. Thomas led him to a study, where a wooden box sat atop a desk. "I wanted to show you something," Thomas said, lifting the lid. Inside was a collection of old documents, faded photographs, and a military service medal resting in a velvet case. But it was the worn, leather-bound journal that Thomas picked up and placed in Frank's hands. "This belonged to my Uncle James," Thomas said quietly. "We found it among his things when the army sent his belongings home after the war. My father never read it, said it hurt too much. But I did. And now, after reading your article, I think you need to see it." Frank hesitated for only a moment before opening the journal. The pages were filled with neat, careful handwriting, the voice of a young soldier preserving his thoughts in ink. He flipped through slowly, taking in snippets of James's life during the war. February 1945, "We lost 3 men today. The cold is unbearable, but thinking of Margaret keeps me going. April 1945, Rusty saved my life again. I don't know how that dog knows when danger is coming, but he does. He sleeps by my side every night. Feels like he's the only thing keeping me sane out here." And then, finally, near the end of the journal. November 1945, "I wrote Margaret a letter today. Gave it to Rusty. If I don't make it, I pray he does." Frank exhaled sharply. The journal confirmed what James had written in his letter. Rusty had been entrusted with his final words. But what neither James nor Margaret had ever known was that somehow, along the way, Rusty had lost his way home. Frank ran a hand down his face. He really believed that dog would make it. Thomas nodded. And in a way, he did. Just 80 years too late. Frank looked down at the journal, then back at Thomas. "This should be in a museum. Your uncle's story, it's bigger than just a letter." Thomas smiled faintly. "I was thinking the same thing." They sat in silence for a moment, both men reflecting on the strange way history had finally found its way home. That evening, as Frank drove back to his ranch, the sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose. Daisy rested her head on his lap, her tail thumping softly against the seat. "You carried something important, girl," Frank murmured, running a hand over her fur. "And now, it's finally where it belongs." Back home, he placed the journal beside the letter on his desk, staring at them for a long while. He thought about James, about Margaret, about Rusty, a war dog who had never stopped trying to find his way home. Maybe, in some way, he finally had. Frank exhaled and leaned back in his chair, listening to the quiet hum of the Texas night. Some stories took longer than others to find their endings. But this one had finally been told. The sun was setting over the Texas horizon, casting a warm glow across the ranch as Frank sat on his porch, the letter and journal resting on the small wooden table beside him. The air was thick with the scent of dry earth and hay, the sound of crickets humming in the distance. It was the kind of evening that made a man feel both small and infinite all at once. Daisy lay at his feet, her tail giving a lazy thump against the porch boards. She had no idea, of course, what she had carried with her, or what she had unknowingly delivered. Frank reached down and scratched behind her ears. "You did good, girl." It had been a long road, but somehow, against all odds, James Holloway's letter had found its way home. The journal, the letter, the photographs, they had all been given to the local history museum, where James and Margaret's story could be told for generations to come. Frank had gone with Thomas Holloway to hand everything over, watching as the curator carefully placed the items behind glass, preserving them as a testament to a love that had endured beyond war, beyond time. Margaret and James, side by side again. And yet, as Frank sat there, staring out at the land he had worked for decades, he realized something else. This wasn't just their story. It was his too. For years, he had believed his life had already been written. That the best days were behind him, that his purpose had been fulfilled long ago. He had loved and lost, had built and buried, had lived and let go. But this journey, this discovery, had reminded him that life wasn't done with him yet. Stories weren't just found in books or in old letters tucked away in dog collars. They were in the choices we made. In the risks we took. In the simple act of deciding to care. Frank took a deep breath, watching as the last bit of sunlight dipped below the horizon. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the weight of loneliness pressing down on him. Instead, he felt something else. A quiet kind of peace. He reached for his mug, took a slow sip, and smiled. "Guess we all find our way home eventually, huh, girl?" Daisy wagged her tail in response, as if she already knew. And maybe she did. Maybe she always had. The night had settled over the ranch, a deep, quiet calm stretching across the fields. Frank Callahan sat on his porch, the letter and journal now carefully stored away. The soft glow of the lantern beside him flickered against the wood, casting long shadows. Daisy lay beside his chair, breathing in steady, contented rhythm. She had been with him through all of this, unaware of the history she had carried, the story she had helped complete. Frank let out a slow breath, watching the stars blink into existence. Some stories take a lifetime to find their endings. Some never get the chance. James Holloway's letter had traveled through time, through war, through generations of dogs who had unknowingly carried his last words. And even though it had arrived decades too late for Margaret, it had still found a way to fulfill its purpose. Frank thought about that. About how life had a strange way of guiding things where they needed to go, even when it took longer than expected. He thought about himself, too. For years, he had believed his own story had already been written. That he was just waiting out the years, tending to the land, filling the days with routine. But now, he wasn't so sure. Maybe there was still more left to do. More stories left to tell. He reached down, running a hand over Daisy's fur. "Funny thing, huh?" he murmured. "All this time, and you were carrying history with you." She let out a soft sigh, pressing her warm body against his boot. Frank smiled. Life had a way of surprising you. Of reminding you that even when you thought the past was behind you, sometimes it had one last thing to say. He took a slow sip of his coffee, letting the night settle around him. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't just looking back. He was looking forward. Because some stories don't end. They just find new beginnings. Life is full of unfinished stories. Sometimes, we don't get the closure we long for. Promises remain unfulfilled, words remain unsaid, and people we love are lost before we can tell them what they meant to us. But that doesn't mean those stories are forgotten. James Holloway's letter never reached Margaret in time, but it still carried its message through generations. Even though she never read his words, their love endured, preserved in memories, in actions, and in the silent devotion of a dog who carried a promise longer than anyone ever realized. This story reminds us that love, in all its forms, transcends time. Even when we think something is lost forever, it may still find its way home. Fate has a way of guiding things to where they belong, even if it takes longer than we expect. It also teaches us about the importance of paying attention to the past. There are histories hidden all around us, within old letters, in forgotten memories, in things as simple as a worn-out dog collar. Taking the time to uncover them can connect us to something greater than ourselves. Finally, Frank's journey reminds us that life is never truly finished until we stop living it. Even in our later years, even when we think we've seen all that life has to offer, new stories still find us. Sometimes, all it takes is a willingness to listen, to care, and to act. Because some stories don't end. They just wait for someone to bring them home.